Well, thank you everybody for coming to the first lecture series that I've put together here at KCAC. My name is Babs. I'm really excited to have Stuart here to give us a four-part lecture series. Tonight we're going to be going over the 50s and 60s, I believe.
60s, yeah.
60s. And then next Friday we'll go to the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So a little history before Pride Month to kind of get us ready for it and get going. So I'll let Stuart take it away.
All right, thank you, Babs.
Yes.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate you making the effort. And I come to you from the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America, which is an LGBTQ archive that is housed in the library at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And it's been around for over 15 years. And one of the exciting things about such an archive is that we've been able to uncover and reveal stories like the one that I'll share with you tonight and the subsequent Fridays. And so tonight's talk is really about activism pre-Stonewall. Not everybody, but many people believe that queer activism started in June of 1969 with the Stonewall uprising in New York City. And the truth of the matter is there were nearly 2 decades of activism that led up to Stonewall, and Kansas Cityans had a very important role in that movement, and that's what we'll be discussing tonight. So it's never been easy to be a homosexual in this country, and that was particularly the case after the Second World War, because what happened during the war is that gays and lesbians found each other. They were thrown together in this conflict in various fashions, and they recognized that there were other people like them and that they weren't alone. And so when the war was over, rather than moving back to Clinton, Missouri, or Eureka Springs, Arkansas, what happened was a lot of folks congregated in coastal cities like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and also in DC. And so what we see in the years after the war is the rise of a very visible community in all these cities. And one of the themes in queer history is that with increased visibility comes increased oppression. And that was the case here. And so what happened in the late 40s and early 50s was, as the country tried to return to normal, one of the things that they focused on was the oppression of queer people, codified in federal employment with some actions taken by various leaders that led to a purge of gay people who worked for the federal government, and that then spilled over into the society at large so that people felt freer to clamp down on queer people. And in response to this clampdown, what we see in the early 1950s is the formation of some advocacy groups in primarily the West Coast. The Mattachine Society, One Incorporated, and the Daughters of Bilitis. Mattachine was formed in Los Angeles in 1950, One in Los Angeles in 1953, and the Daughters of Bilitis were formed in San Francisco in 1955. And these organizations chose these names, these obscure names, intentionally. It was a cover for the organizations and for the members of those organizations. A Mattachine is a Renaissance court figure that spoke truth to power behind a mask. One takes its name from a quote from the Victorian philosopher Thomas Carlyle, "A mystic bond of brotherhood makes all men one." And the Daughters of Bilitis fashioned their name after groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution. But Bilitis is a minor, very minor character in the poetry of Sappho, the ancient Greek poet who wrote love poems to women. She lived on the island of Lesbos, and that's where the term lesbian comes from. So these were all attempts to figure out how to fight back against this organized and institutionalized oppression. And they they worked together, they worked collectively, and over time, their movement became known as the homophile movement. And a homophile is a homosexual, but they wanted to pull the sex out of the terminology. And of course, the suffix phile means a lover of. So a bibliophile is a lover of books, or a francophile is a lover of all things French. A homophile is a lover of the same. And so in this homophile movement, what these organizations did was they created a means of communication. So these chapters get started on the West Coast, and then chapters get scattered across the country. And it is through these publications that the leaders on the West Coast started conversations around how do we secure civil rights for our community. And it's in the pages of these magazines that those conversations take place. The Mattachine Review, obviously from Mattachine Society, one from One Incorporated, and the latter was the Daughters of Bilitis publication. And it was a very critical piece of moving this movement forward because, like I said, it's in the pages of these magazines that these conversations take place. And for younger people, it was a very slow process. It wasn't happening in your pocket immediately. What happened was an article would be written, and then in the next month's issue, someone would write a letter in response to that article. In the next month's issue, someone would write a letter in response to the letter in response to the article. So it was a slow process, but nonetheless, it was a process that allowed people, number one, to participate, and number two, to really focus on the best strategies for making this movement go forward. And the other key factor of these publications, because they were distributed nationally, it was the beginning of a national movement. And so these were really a critical piece of that effort. Despite that, though, by the mid-1960s, these organizations really aren't making the progress that they want. And so they get some new folks involved, and these folks introduce some new techniques. They take a cue from the Black Civil Rights Movement and do protests outside of institutions that represent oppression, like the Pentagon or the Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Putting the word lesbian on the cover of your magazine aimed at lesbians. It's a pretty minor thing, but it was a very big deal at the time because by the mid-60s, these are available not only to members of the organizations, but also on newsstands. And so it was a radical step to put the word lesbian on the masthead of your publication. Also, this was from another organization that was based in Philadelphia, and this gentleman who edited the publication decided to infuse it with a little bit of eroticism in order to get people interested in the publication. And it worked. This one had the highest circulation of all the magazines. But by the mid-60s, they're still not making the progress that they want to make. It's really incremental and really, really slow. And so what they decided to do, the leaders of these organizations scattered across the country, is they decided to come to Kansas City and meet in person. Up to this point, all communication had been done by telephone or by letter. They haven't never really gotten together collectively from all across the country to strategize. And so that's what they decided to do in Kansas City. And one of the reasons for that, a couple of reasons for that. One was the fact that there was the organizations were on either coast by this point. They were on the East Coast and they were on the West Coast primarily. And so they were squabbling about which coast to travel to. So they decided to meet in the middle. And another factor that played into that was that there was already a very active community in Kansas City and a fairly safe community in Kansas City that one of the leaders in the Mattachine Society knew about. He had lived in Kansas City. He worked for the Star and had actually gotten fired from the Star on a morals charge. And so he relocated to San Francisco and got involved with Mattachine. And so he knew people here, he knew the scene, and so he recommended that the folks come here and have their conference. And it was a very active scene in Kansas City. There were a number of different bars. The Gaslight was located over on Broadway, where Woody's is now. The Rail Room was a lesbian bar, which was located in this building. So this is where the Western Crown Center is now. This is looking at from Union Station to the southeast, where Crown Center is. And like I said, the Rail Room was in this building. It was a bar for railroaders during the day, and then with the approval of the management, 5 o'clock, it magically changes into a lesbian bar. And they had their own house band. The rail runners. It was quite a popular bar with the women. The Arabian Nights was right over here. So it was located on Gillum, sort of the curve that it makes once you're past Linwood, the curve that it makes going south. It's now the Costco parking lot. And the Redhead was located in Westport. It was located where Tin Roof is now, right there on Broadway and Westport Road. But the bar that was probably the most active and probably most well-known in the city was the Jewel Box Lounge, which was located at 3219 Troost, just right over here at Troost, on Troost. The building is still there. If you look for the building with these glass bricks, that's where the Jewel Box was. And the Jewel Box was known locally and actually nationally as a center for drag, for female impersonation. Femme mimics, as they called themselves. Very well known. People who toured, performers who toured, made sure that they stopped at the Jewel Box. The club had opened in 1945. And then that strip of Troost was a really, really busy business district. And it was just a regular lounge. And then late 50s, they started showing drag, and insanely popular, really, really popular. At first with the gay crowd, but then it started to draw a straight audience, because what would happen is mom and pop would drive in from Liberty or Raytown, go to dinner, and then go see a show of the funny ladies at the Jewel Box. And at one point, they were doing 4 shows a night on Fridays and Saturdays, and 3 shows a night every other night but Sunday and Monday. And so the guys who owned this club were making money hand over fist. And that allowed them to produce a lot of memorabilia from the club. And these are some images of performers inside the club from 1959. This is Skip Arnold, who was a very well-known and beloved drag queen during this period and into the 1970s. Even though he looks exactly like Daisy Bouquet, it's really kind of weird. So like I said, they were able to produce all sorts of memorabilia, which is great for an archivist, and matchbooks, programs. The performers were always listed as Mr. That was at the insistence of the management of the club, because they wanted to just impress upon people that this was an illusion. These were mimics. And this is a postcard of some of the performers in their finery, and the washerwoman character in the middle. The story goes that they would do their acts, and then at the end of the show, the washerwoman would come out and mop the stage and make satiric commentary on the evening's proceedings, and then reveal herself to be Ray Bourbon, who performed earlier in the evening dressed like the other performers. And Ray Bourbon is a very, very interesting character. I have to go on a sidetrack and talk a little bit about Ray Bourbon. Bourbon was a performer for most of the 20th century. And according to Bourbon's own publicity, he performed for the King of Spain and for other royalty, as well as he was a friend of Mae West. And the earliest, this is some of his early performing shots, publicity shots. The earliest evidence we have of Bourbon being in Kansas City is 1934 at a club called Dante's Inferno. Dante's was also a center of female impersonation 30 years before the Jewel Box. It was located down at Independence Avenue and Troost. And like I said, Bourbon performed throughout most of the 20th century, and he was a pretty astute businessman. He made recordings his entire career, first on 78 RPM records, discs. And then when LP technology came about, he produced a number of different LPs of his performance. Early on, they were songs, double entendre kinds of songs that he would sing. And then as time moved forward, it was really just more of a straight kind of stand-up comedy act. And if you're inclined, all of Ray Bourbon's recordings are available on the Internet Archive. And they're kind of interesting and worth a listen. Again, as an astute businessman, by the 1950s, by the early 50s into the mid-50s, he was having trouble getting work. Because of this return to normalcy that was sort of spreading through the country, there was also a clampdown on drag early in the decade. And this is about the same time as the Christine Jorgensen story. Christine Jorgensen was an American who went to Denmark and had what we would now call gender confirmation surgery. She was one of the first Westerners to do that, and drew a ton of publicity as a result. Everyone had heard of Christine Jorgensen. And so, because Bourbon was having trouble getting work, he came up with this scheme where he claimed that he had gone to Mexico and had done the same thing. And so therefore, he wasn't really impersonating a woman anymore. He was a woman. It wasn't true. None of it was true, but he claimed that. He even used it in his promotional material. He made a recording that said, "Let me tell you about my operation." So he carried it out that far. And ultimately, by the early 1960s, probably about 1962, he ends up at the Jewel Box. And he makes this recording, records his show live inside the Jewel Box in 1964. And towards the latter part of the 60s, the end of the 60s, he decides to retire and relocate to to Mexico. And Bourbon's a huge animal lover, huge. And so on the trip to Mexico, newspaper accounts noted that he took with him 70 dogs, 5 cats, and 2 skunks. And so, of course, that's a lot to travel with from Kansas City to Mexico. About halfway down, he stops at a place in Texas and decides to board the animals and goes on to Mexico and gets established. What he doesn't do is pay his bill at the kennel. And so the kennel owner sells the animals, which infuriates Bourbon. Infuriates him to the point that he reaches out to a couple of young men living here in Kansas City. They get together at this place in Texas, and they hatch a plan to murder the kennel owner, and they do. They kill him, and they don't do a very good job of it, and so they all get caught, and Bourbon is convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and ends up in prison and dies in prison in 1971. It's a really interesting story. I know. From what I've heard, there's a man on the East Coast who's working on a musical of Ray Bourbon's life. So let's hope he gets it done. So the other bar, the other very well-known bar in the community, at least, was the Colony. And the Colony was in the next block south of the Jewel Box. It was at 3325 Troost. And it really was a gay bar. They showed drag there, but they didn't show it nearly to the extent that they did at the Jewel Box. But it was quite popular in the community. And we have a really interesting collection of images in the archive of clubgoers outside of the bar. This mosaic wall is the exterior of the club. And so it's a really interesting, and these date from 59 to 68. So it's a really interesting array of party pics. These are now things that you would put on your social media, right? What's also interesting about the images is that everybody's looking at the camera. If you took a camera into a gay bar in 1965, you should get a lot of this, because people don't want to be recorded as being in a gay bar. So what that tells us is that the subjects in the photographs knew the photographer. And that was the case. The donors who gave us the images had done some legwork, and they tracked down that the photographer was a member of the community. He'd been a bartender at the Jewel Box. He'd been a bartender at another club. And so folks knew this guy, and so they were willing to have their photographs taken. At the same time, there's a very significant drag ball scene in Kansas City. These are ads from the Kansas City Star advertising these drag balls in 1965 in what we would now call an event space at 31st and Forest, right around the corner from where the Jewel Box and the Colony were. So in that same set of images, there are pictures from these drag balls. Again, party pics of folks having a good time at these events. So much drag is going on in Kansas City that this woman came in 1965. Her name is Esther Newton. She's still living. At this point in her life, she was an anthropology PhD student, and her focus for her dissertation was on female impersonation. She used Kansas City and she used Chicago as her case studies. And when it was published commercially, it was published as Mother Camp, Female Impersonators in America in 1972, and it was the first scholarly look at female impersonation to be published in the country. That's her with Skip Arnold, who was also educated in anthropology, so they really hit it off. So all this is going on, so it makes sense for the leaders of the homophile groups to come to Kansas City, because there's clearly a very bustling scene happening. And so they do come to Kansas City. They meet in February of 1966, February 19th through the 21st. It's a weekend. And they stayed at the State Hotel, which is down at 12th and Wyandotte, was down at 12th and Wyandotte on the northeast corner, down by Barney Alice Plaza. And there's a couple of postcards of what a room looked like. And they're very groovy, jet lounge, cocktail lounge. So they met, and really what they did was they spent a good portion of the time just introducing themselves and introducing the work of their organizations to each other. Remember, this is the first time they've ever met in person. And so it was just an opportunity to network and to kind of schmooze and to just orient themselves to each other. They did walk away with some concrete steps from this meeting, the first of which was to meet again in August of '66 in San Francisco. Secondly, they formed a legal defense fund that people could apply to if they ran into trouble with the law. And they also created an umbrella organization for all of these homophile groups that became known as the North American Conference of Homophile Organizations, NACO, not Nacho, but NACO. And it was under the auspices of NACO that they continued to meet for the rest of the decade. And then they also decided, most concretely, to have the first ever nationally organized protest for gay and lesbian civil rights. And it was aimed at the treatment of queer people in the military. And so the protest was held on Armed Forces Day in May of '66. And there were protests at cities, coordinated protests at cities all across the country. This was the protest outside of the federal building in San Francisco. Los Angeles, the city of cars, what they did was they put these box signs on top of their cars, and they drove throughout the city for about 20 miles just to get their point across to onlookers. There were protests in Seattle, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and then in some of the other cities, folks just got together and talked about the issues, not anything public. And at that meeting in February of '66 was this young man, Drew Schaefer. And Drew was a Kansas Citian, and he was really excited about what was happening in this movement. And so almost immediately after the first NACO meeting, he forms the Phoenix Society for Individual Freedom, Kansas City's first gay and lesbian advocacy group. And this is his sort of announcement, again, in the local paper in 1966, just about 4 or 5 weeks, actually that's about 4 weeks after that initial meeting. That's how quickly he moved on it. And like the other homophile organizations, the Phoenix very quickly started producing its own publication. And that's in large part due to the fact that Drew was very well supported by his parents, Robert and Phyllis. And they had supported Drew his entire life. They were big supporters of the community. And Robert was a printer, so he had access to a printing press. So that's why they were able to start producing their own publication from the get-go. And it's in the pages of this publication that we are able to sort of trace the really kind of amazing level of activity of the members of the Phoenix Society. In every issue, there is reporting on the organization's efforts to reach out to the local religious community and make connections in that way. And you tend not to really see this in other homophile publications. It's kind of interesting that it's sort of, I don't know if it's a Midwest thing or what, but it's very important. Not apparently, it is, because it's, like I said, it's in every issue. It's very important to the members of the Phoenix. The issues had reporting on national and international stories that would be of interest to the community that you couldn't find anywhere else. They would report on the local social scene, and as members of the society traveled across the country, they would report back on what the social scene was like in those cities, like Houston or Des Moines or wherever they might have gone. They also sold ads. The ads never paid for anything, really. They didn't sell enough ads to pay for the creation of the publication. But it's an interesting opportunity to see beyond, the ads that you would expect, like from bars, other businesses in the city that found it worth their effort to advertise in this publication aimed at this market. Members of the Phoenix partnered with official organizations like the Public Health Department of Kansas City, Missouri. They produced this brochure. They produced 2 editions of this brochure on venereal disease and homosexuality, starting in '67. When the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department was trying to improve its relations with minority communities, the police department reached out to the Phoenix. They were that visible as representatives of the local gay and lesbian community. Members of the Phoenix participated in other regional homophile organizations like the Midwest Homophile Conference and the Western Regional Planning Conference, and would attend those meetings. And at that meeting in San Francisco of the North American Conference of Homophile Organizations, the members of the Phoenix, because of their access to this printing press, were designated the homophile clearinghouse, or the clearinghouse of the homophile movement. And what that meant was that the other homophile organizations scattered across the country could send their stuff to Kansas City, and then it would be printed and distributed from here for a fee, for a very small fee, minor fee. So not only are they doing all this stuff that's reflected in the pages of their own publication, they've taken on all this work to be the information clearinghouse for this entire national movement. And again, this is in a day before computers. So all this stuff, all the printing, all the address list management, everything is done by paper, by letter, or by phone. To me, it's just a logistical nightmare and so much work. So there's a lot going on. They're very, very busy. And these are some of the publications that were produced and distributed from Kansas City. Vector was out of Los Angeles. Tangents was out of San Francisco. And the Blue and the Homophile Action League newsletter was out of Philadelphia. So we really were the hub of the information that was being generated in this movement. By 1968, they opened up the Phoenix House, the spring of '68. The Phoenix House was the first gay and lesbian community center in Kansas City. It was located on the southwest corner of Paseo and, oh my God, it's not Linwood, Armour. No, it was Linwood and the Paseo, yeah, where the Scottish Rite Temple is. It was right across the street from the Scottish Rite Temple. It's now a school. And it's a typical Kansas City shirtwaist. The first floor were the public offices. The second floor were apartments for folks who had been made homeless. And then the third floor was Drew's apartment. And then in the basement, at this point, they finally had their own printing press. So this is where the printing equipment was. And also in 1968, the NACO meeting is held in Chicago. And at that meeting, they adopt this slogan, "Gay is good," based on the "Black is beautiful" motto for the Black Civil Rights Movement. And what is happening within the movement at this point, because this is pretty late in the decade, again, this is 1968, is there's a new generation of activists who are coming on the scene who want to be far more assertive and far more aggressive and even militant in their approach to moving these efforts forward, much more so than the kind of conservative, more timid homophiles. And so you start to see evidence of this tension within the movement. And it happened in the Black Civil Rights Movement, it happened in the feminist movement. It's just kind of a logical thing when you think about it, that younger people are going to want to try a different approach. And that's what happened. And it culminates, of course, in June of '69 at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And just very briefly, Stonewall is really comprised of 3 nights of rioting. The first night was spontaneous in response to a raid on the bar, and then the subsequent 2 nights were planned. There were planned protests in the neighborhood where the bar was. By that point, of course, after the first night, the bar was shut down. But it was that spontaneous uprising where the bargoers had gotten the upper hand with the police, and they had the police barricaded in the bar at one point during the evening. That really was a flashpoint in this movement, because nobody had ever gotten the upper hand with the cops before. And to have the fairies do it was really, really amazing and really empowering. And it changed the nature of this struggle almost literally overnight. Because what happens in the weeks, literally the weeks after and the months after Stonewall, is a whole new raft of organizations that get formed that adopt this far more very militant approach to these efforts. The Gay Liberation Front forms in late summer of 1969. You can see it in the name. They're not hiding behind Mattachine. They're not hiding behind Velitas. We are a front of gay people who want our liberation. That's first and foremost. That's the first thing you see. The Gay Activist Alliance was also formed. Both of these were formed in New York City. Took a little more structured approach than the Gay Liberation Front, but the Liberation Front really resonated with young people. Within a couple of years, there were hundreds of chapters across the country, primarily at universities and colleges. The Radical Lesbians form in 1970. Also in 1970, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries get formed by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. And so these are very, very different than the homophiles. Really, really different. Also in the summer of 1969, in August of '69, the homophiles come back to Kansas City, and they meet at the Belle Reve Hotel over at Armour and Warwick. The building is still there. And they had planned a week-long series of conferencey stuff, meetings about different aspects of the work that they were trying to get done. And they did make a little bit of progress, and they got a little more press coverage locally, but the meetings were taken over by these energized young people. And so there was lots of, more than just squabbling, there was lots of arguing. It was very confrontational, and it really signaled to some of the older homophiles that things were on the way to change. Things were changing, and so it signaled to them that perhaps their approach was coming to an end, and that was exactly the case. And that was bolstered by the fact that a year after the uprising in Greenwich Village at the Stonewall, there was an effort made to commemorate that uprising, and it was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day. And it involved a parade through the middle of Manhattan from Greenwich Village up to Central Park, which is a long way to walk. And it was originally around 2,000 people. But what happened, you know how these counts go, what happened was, as the march progressed forward, and it seemed to be safe to take part in it, because when they were gathering, people were throwing eggs at them and verbally harassing them. As they moved forward, people just sort of stepped off the sidewalk and marched with the units in the parade. And so, again, they gather. These are some of the organizations that participated. There's the Mattachine Society of Washington, and they end up gathering in the Sheep's Meadow at Central Park, and it's thousands and thousands of people. And it's, again, as energizing as what had taken place before, a year before, just to know that there were all these people who were now ready and to be public and to try something different in terms of trying to secure their civil rights. And it's because of this that we have Pride. That's why Pride is in June. This was the first Pride. It wasn't called Pride, it was the Christopher Street Liberation Day, but it eventually becomes known as Pride. And even this early on, there were commemorations in other cities in the United States and actually across the globe. So again, this is why we have Pride, because of that uprising in New York City. So the difference between these two pictures is 5 years. That's how condensed all this change was. It was a lot of significant change in a very short amount of time. And it was a movement that, again, Kansas Cityans had a very important role in. By 1970, NACO met in San Francisco for the last time. They just recognized that there was no sense in continuing. Again, with the formation of all these other groups like the Gay Liberation Front and Radical Lesbians, they saw the writing on the wall, and so they disbanded. And the Phoenix Society, in early '71, it was time to reincorporate, and they decided not to reincorporate, in large part because they had overstretched themselves with the running of the community center, with the running of the information clearinghouse and the organization. It was just too much. The Phoenix was never very big. I've never seen a count, but at most it couldn't have been more than 40 or 50 people. And you know how it is when you work in an organization like that. It's usually a core group of about 10 or 12 people who do all the work. And so there just wasn't anyone to continue the work of the Phoenix. And Drew was heavily in debt. And so it was decided again in February to not reincorporate. And so again, this intense level of change in this short amount of time that Kansas Cityans, again, had a very important role in and contributed to, so much so that we felt it important to commemorate when the 50th anniversary came around in 2016. So we put together a community committee, and we fabricated this historic marker that it was and will be located down in Barney Alice Plaza, across catty corner from where the hotel was, where that first meeting took place in 1966, because we felt it was that big of a deal that it needed to be remembered and it needed to be commemorated. Not only that meeting, but also the formation of the Phoenix Society, which followed the meeting. Right now, the marker is in storage because Barney Alice Plaza is a hole in the ground. Once it is finished and turned into whatever it's going to be, we have been promised by the city that our marker will be reinstalled. And trust me, I'm keeping an eye on it very, very, very closely. So I will make sure that that happens. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Do you mind reiterating when the Phoenix Center closed?
The Phoenix Society did not incorporate in early 1970. So by 1970, it was gone. What else? I'm actually working on a book, and it has narrowed. It's been a long haul, but it is narrowed its focus now to this series of talks, activism from the 50s to the 90s.
So important, because I usually Kansas City had a role in some of these things, but it's very okay.
Yeah.
In terms of like the stories that.
Yeah. Well, I'm blessed because I get to engage with this stuff all day, every day. Like I was working on some stuff earlier today, and so I recognize the importance, which is why I do stuff like this, the importance of sharing these stories, and I really, really want to get them written down. Yeah, because I've got about 4 years left of work, so I'm hoping to get it done before I retire. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the direct search. Is there a moment like that? Or is this ever gone?
I think that level of such drastic change is unique to this moment. Because as we'll talk about next week, what we see in Kansas City is really parallels what happens across the country. We see these new groups start to form, and then kind of the community just gets sort of absorbed into the culture more, and becomes more visible. And again, with visibility comes oppression. So we see the rise of people like Anita Bryant and Briggs out in California. So. And then it's an interesting story that just repeats itself over and over. And to your point, though, I can't think of a period where this kind of change really did take place in such a short period of time. This was just a unique set of circumstances, and generationally too, that plays into it, because these were boomers, and there's only one baby boom generation, and there were just so many of them, and they had become so I don't want to say privileged, but used to getting their way. And with student protests, like the anti-war protests and all of that stuff, and these guys just modeled themselves on that approach, and we don't see that happen again, really, until the period that I think comes closest probably is the AIDS crisis, again, because it's so drastic and so immediate that it does have parallels to this level of change, but it's of course it's very different. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The only thing you mentioned about the Kansas City police seemed to be a good thing in the society, or was the relationship better here in other places, or were the rates as well?
It's really interesting. And that's one of the reasons that the homophile leaders came here was because the bars tended not to get raided here, and of course there's no documentation, but and the many people that I have talked to over the years, the bars were owned by the mafia and they were paying off the cops. the bars weren't owned by the mafia and they weren't paying off the cops. So I don't know what to believe, again, because there's no documentation and I need a piece of paper.
On oral history, there talks about the parade they had in the paddy wagon commemorating this activity, and what that points to is there were raids, but it doesn't seem to be, vitriolic or as frequent as it was in the larger city.
Well, and nothing like New York, because New York, it was a system. I mean, the cops would call the bar owners and say, okay, we're going to raid on this day, and then the bar owners knew, and the cops were also in cahoots with these high-priced lawyers. And so when people got arrested at these raids, then the cops would recommend them to these high-priced lawyers, who then charged exorbitant fees to the folks who'd been arrested, and part of the fees were kicked back to the cops. So it was very, very well organized, and that was not the case here. And the other thing that's unique about Kansas City is that it was much safer to dance, because it was verboten in New York and other big cities. Here, because of the relaxed relationship with the cops, it tended to be a much more common activity. Yeah.
You mentioned that local publication was one of the unique publications in that they reached out to local religious organizations. Can you maybe elaborate on that? How did we exemplify reaching out to local organizations?
They reported on all sorts of efforts to do outreach to local churches, local conglomerations of ministers, of what we would now call affirming congregations. They even had, there was a guy on the board of the Phoenix who was their chaplain. And so, which I haven't seen that in any of the other organizational structures of, like the Mattachine or One. They didn't have a chaplain. So it's a really interesting feature of the work that they were doing here.
Were they visiting churches, or were
They were visiting churches, and they were engaging with congregations, maybe not in like on a Sunday, but in different ways, but primarily engaging with leadership. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, in fact, your Schaefer's story is so well preserved because that inherited the scrapbooks that his father put together and asked them to.
Are you church
MCC.
Yeah. She was one of the founders of MCC. His mother was. Yeah. And she kept these amazing scrapbooks. Oh my God, they're so gorgeous. She would clip articles, and she was an inveterate letter writer, and so she'd write to people, politicians and TV people, and they'd write her back, and she'd paste it into the scrapbooks. But the scrapbooks themselves were old wallpaper sample books. So they're these big giant books, and everything's scotch taped in on this really terribly acidic paper. So they're a preservation nightmare, but they're also a really beautiful sculpture. There are two of them, and they run from the mid-'60s to the mid-'80s. Drew passed in '89, and so she stopped after that. But yeah, they're an amazing record. Yes, ma'am.
The local government at the time, just the politicians, just largely apathetic to the scene.
Yeah, they weren't paying any attention to it at all. It was just, if anything, it was the goofy ladies over at the Jewel Box, and that was really the extent of their awareness of the community.
Did that change? Like, did they start? Because now it's so
Right. It starts to change a little bit in the 70s as well, and we'll see how it changes over the next 3 weeks. It changes a little bit in the 70s, and again, really comes to the forefront in the 80s. Becomes, by necessity, the local government has to get involved with the community on this, at least that particular issue. Mm-hmm.
So with these different bars, did the management of these bars take a pretty active role in protecting the
patrons that they served, or because what I heard about just listening about New York, it's like we're going to plan this rave, and then I mean, what does a manager do? They're just like, okay, yeah, okay, good to know. I just hear maybe a different mindset and culture between how patrons are and aren't protected in Kansas City versus some of these other areas.
Well, and the bars over on Truce were all owned by the same individual. And so because he's making so much money, he's gonna want to keep his customers happy. And similarly with some of the other clubs, and again, they didn't, the need to protect their clients wasn't as great as it was in places like New York City, just because we weren't experiencing the same things. Uh-huh.
Mine's not a question, but a thank you.
Oh, of course.
To have this lecture series is really great for KCAC because it's a space that we get to learn and grow together and have it be free access. We get 3 more installments, and so that's very exciting for at least my end too, to be able to be a part of this. Also, thank you to everyone.
Well, I think it's also important to point out that this collection has been the object of intense attention from artists since it began, and many artists have contributed to it. So we're really grateful to be present here in a community home for the arts, in a community that has contributed so much and benefited so much.
It's Christopher Leach. He's a co-founder of the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America, way back in the day.
I'm not listening. I am that.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, thank you all so much for coming.